Thanks, everyone. Sylvia, if you're ready, you're.
I hope you can see me. I'm not, can you? Well, welcome everybody. Good afternoon and good morning to those on the West Coast. I'm Sylvia Tamarkin. I'm president of the Arizona section of NCJW, and I'm also a journalist and documentary filmmaker who has been covering and reporting about the abortion wars for the past 5 years or so. And so I am very delighted to participate in this webinar. LEAD, Organizing Skills for Grassroots Advocates, is a monthly webinar series designed to provide organizing and advocacy skills. And this summer, NCJW hosted a special series of LEAD focusing on the intersection of abortion and other critical issues. We are incredibly grateful to have Jacqueline Dean, Policy Manager at the National Asian Pacific Women's Forum, and Sonia Schwartz, Senior Policy Attorney at the National Immigration Law Center and co-chair of the Protecting Immigrant Families campaign, who have joined us for the continuation of this series to discuss abortion and immigration. The intersectionality of abortion and immigration is all part of the intersectionality of classism, sexism, and racism that has defined the opposition movement in this country, those who would oppose women's or any individual's reproductive rights and freedoms. With this administration, there is definitely a link between the anti-abortion and anti-immigrant stance. It goes back to the early origins of the anti-abortion movement, which involves maintaining the purity of the dominant race. And it's interesting that now, when we see the rise of white supremacism again, it is definitely becoming a dominant issue. You may unfortunately remember the tragic death of Heather Heyer in the Charlottesville demonstrations. And following her death, the editor of the online Der Stürmer Nazi publication said Heather deserved to die because she was unmarried and childless and was not doing what she was supposed to do to procreate her race. So maintaining the dominant white race in this country is part of what is also prompting the anti-abortion movement. And one might say, well, wait a moment, because the effects of the anti-abortion movement certainly are felt by women of color. But I've been told in a number of speeches and panels that I have participated in that this is all part of keeping a minority population at a lower economic rung. The more children, the less opportunity for economic advancement. And it's also certainly what is happening with the administration's policy of not allowing the immigrants into this country and detaining them now in Mexico and certainly in detention centers. So the intersectionality of these issues certainly fits in with the NCJW agenda. We have been trying to work toward humane treatment of detainees, and certainly reproductive justice defines NCJW. Last week, as a matter of fact, a week and a half ago, the Arizona section of NCJW was a co-sponsor with NOW, National Organization of Women, on a program called Unlock the Future, which protested against the treatment of women and girls in detention centers where they are subjected to strip searches, they are denied adequate menstrual products during their periods. Certainly, there have been a number of instances where they have even been raped in the detention centers. But many of the women and girls who have arrived, who are in the centers, fled because of sexual assault or were sexually assaulted en route. And we all know, and I'm sure we're going to hear more about, the cases of attempted denial of abortion for teenagers who were in the camps, and the ACLU lawsuit that ultimately said they needed to have that right exercised. And I'm sure that we all remember the former head of the Office of Refugee Relocation, Scott Lloyd, who denied young women the right to an abortion, who even forcibly tried to lock a woman in a room so that she would not be able to take the second pill for medicinal abortion. We know that he created a policy that is still followed by his successor, where they are monitoring women and girls' menstrual cycles in the detention centers. So this kind of inhumane treatment is all part of the characterization of the other that has surfaced in recent years, and particularly in this climate of white supremacy and anti-immigration. So the two subjects are inextricably linked, and they are, of course, two topics that NCJW advocates to support reproductive justice and to support adequate, humane treatment for refugees. So I think we have a very interesting program ahead of us. I would like to say that we're very excited to learn more about the connection between these issues and to hear from Jacqueline and Sonia. The National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum is the only organization focused on building power with Asian American Pacific Islander women and girls to influence critical decisions that affect their lives, families, and their communities. And using a reproductive justice framework, the organization elevates Asian American and Pacific Islander women and girls to impact policy and drive systemic change in three core issues: reproductive health and rights, economic justice, and immigration and racial justice. Similarly, the National Immigration Law Center is one of the leading organizations in the US exclusively dedicated to defending and advancing the rights of immigrants and low-income individuals. So that organization co-leads the Protecting Immigrant Families campaign, which is made up of hundreds of diverse organizations, including NCJW. And they are working to develop innovative advocacy strategies, distribute educational resources, and keep allies informed of all the current and potential policies that impact immigrant families. Following Jacqueline and Sonia's presentations, we will discuss how you can take action by linking your reproductive health, rights, and justice efforts with immigration policy work. And we will then move to a Q&A. Please use the chat box to submit your questions, and Shannon will moderate these questions and be sure to repeat instructions later. So let's get started.
Hi folks, this is Sonia. Do you want me to get started?
Yep, go ahead, Sonia. Thanks, Sivia.
Okay. Hi folks, this is Sonia Schwartz at the National Immigration Law Center, and I'm thrilled to be here today. And I wanted to thank all of you for your membership in the Protecting Immigrant Families campaign. Sivia, I'm wondering if you could mute your line. I'm hearing an echo.
Okay, I'm trying to.
I'll take care of that, Sivia.
That's better. Okay, next slide. So I'm just going to quickly talk about what public charge is and why the Trump administration is focused on it, a little bit about what its effects are on access to health care, give you some tips on talking with immigrant families about this issue, or enrolling in healthcare programs, or seeking healthcare services, whether they're reproductive health services or others, and how you can get involved to protect immigrant families. Okay, next slide. So public charge has been around for more than 100 years, and it's a concept that allows the United States to deny people either visas to enter our country from abroad or to gain permanent legal status once they're here. And basically it allows us to deny someone who is likely at any time to become a public charge. It's based on a principle that someone is a public charge if they're primarily dependent on government for subsistence, not using a support program like healthcare or nutrition, but actually relying primarily on government for their income and well-being. In the last few decades, because of the way this policy has played out, very, very few people were denied visas or green cards on public charge grounds. This is really for two reasons. One, because eligibility is really limited and narrow for people who become, before they gain legal permanent resident status. And second, because Congress requires most people applying for immigrant visas or green cards to have financial sponsors, usually family members or employers, who show they have sufficient income to prevent future dependency on public benefits. Next slide. So why on earth is the Trump administration focused on this obscure immigration policy called public charge? Before Trump, I think 3 people knew about it, and most of them worked at my organization. So basically, they came out with legislative proposals that would not only block people from entering this country without status, but that would also really limit legal immigration. And absolutely none of those proposals went anywhere in Congress. So they had to look to executive actions or agency policies that didn't require Congress to do anything to try to limit legal immigration. So they did 2 things basically with the policy they're trying to make happen. One, they created a wealth test that would deny green cards and visas to many low and even moderate income immigrants, not to mention that most of these immigrants are people of color. And they also, second, wanted to terrify immigrant families already here so that they would drop their children's health, nutrition, and housing programs. And basically, the most important thing to know, and the reason we're spending so much time on this webinar, is actually of all Trump's measures to reduce immigration, and particularly legal immigration, this one has the biggest impact. Researchers have estimated that as many as 26 million people living in immigrant families are touched by this potential policy change. And I know that sounds like a crazy big number, but when you think about the fact that 1 in 4 children in the United States today have an immigrant parent who's not born in the US, you realize why the scale is so big. Go to the next slide. So I'm just going to spend a couple slides on what this is, but we're going to spend a lot more time about kind of what you can do about it. In a nutshell, public charge does not apply to every immigrant. There's a lot of misinformation and fear around it, but it really only comes up when someone's applying for a green card, or they're trying to enter the US, or if they leave the US for more than 6 months at one time. And there are a lot of people who are exempt from public charge, or even on top of that. So the most important misconception is that you go through a public charge test when you have a green card and you're applying to become a US citizen. You guys may know about this. It's usually 5 years to go from green card to citizen, 3 years if you're through marriage with a citizen. But anyway, there's no public charge test then at all. And there's also an exception for refugees and asylees, women or men who are VAWA, self-petitioners, people who survive domestic violence, torture, and some other humanitarian immigrants. So those folks don't have to worry about public charge. Next. So the Trump administration back in October of last year proposed a terrible rule that would broaden public charge, and they finalized it last August, But thank goodness for all the great public interest lawyers out there across the country and dozens of attorney generals across the country who filed multiple cases in federal court. We had 3 nationwide injunctions, that blocked that rule from going into effect. So I'm not talking about the details of that rule today. Where we are now is that unfortunately we've lost some of our nationwide injunctions, but we still have one really important one coming out of the district court in New York. There will be a hearing on January 7th in the Second Circuit, which is the appellate court for that New York district court. And we'll know more after that. We're very hopeful our injunction will stand, but unfortunately, it does mean that we're likely headed to the Supreme Court with a circuit split, or we may lose after that hearing. So we will be possibly needing to educate people about the rule, but we're not going to go there today. We're living in the positive. So one other thing to know is even if the rule one day takes effect, it won't be retroactive. It will only look at benefits received after the rule takes effect. And most benefits that women and children receive don't count anyway under the rule. Okay, let's go to what the current test is inside the US. I'm gonna do this super fast. So just so you know for today, in case people are in contact with you who are worried about this, a public charge test is forward-looking. It can't be based just on what happens in the past. And under long-standing guidance, it really only looks at 2 different public benefits. And it's also a totality of circumstances test, which we'll talk about in the next slide. But in terms of the public benefits, it's really just 2 that people have to worry about. Cash assistance for income maintenance. You guys may know the TANF program or the SSI program, or your state may have a general assistance program, and people who are institutionalized for long-term care at government expense. That's usually through Medicaid. And this has allowed us to give a clear message to immigrants that it's okay to participate in other public programs, like healthcare programs, like nutrition programs, like programs that help people access women's health services. Next slide. So the current test for people inside the US today is pretty simple, as I said. It's people who are primarily dependent on government. They look at a totality of circumstances, but if someone has a strong affidavit of support from a sponsor, usually they clear that, and then they can only look at these 2 benefits. So it's pretty simple. Let's go on. Now, outside the US, we're in a different posture. And this applies both to people who are trying to come to the US to be reunited with family, and some people who are in the US now who, in order to get lawful permanent residence, have to leave the US and be cleared by a consulate. I know that may seem weird, but some people do have to do that. And unfortunately, the State Department under Trump went ahead with no notice, with no due process, and changed the rules here. And the rules that they put in place are already having a negative effect. They're able to screen out a lot of people in color who are not wealthy from being reunited with family. And they changed the rule in this way. It's not that the definition changed, but it's that that affidavit of support from a sponsor is not sufficient on its own to get people over a hurdle if they are older, if their health isn't great, if they don't have a high income, if their skills are limited. And unfortunately, as part of the test, they can consider benefits used by family members in the US. Now, we don't know that they're actually knowledgeable about that, or that's why they're denying people, but it's possible. So given this confusion outside the US, I want to just go over some tips for figuring out whether someone could be in trouble on public charge grounds. And basically, you ask questions about whether the person is a citizen, whether the person already has a green card, or if the person's potentially a humanitarian immigrant, and if so, they don't have to worry about it. And we have materials for all this. I'm going to whip through these slides next. Is your family member applying for a green card here in the US, inside or outside? Here in the US, green light. Outside the US, yellow light. You need to get more information. Because many of you are focused on women's rights to access abortion or reproductive health care, we just wanted to remind folks about their rights to access health care on this slide. I'm going to whip through this. There are a lot of fears about privacy in addition to fears about public charge and privacy and potential immigration enforcement. And there's another slide about whether it's safe to go to the doctor. This talks about people's protections when they're going to the doctor, and the rights to an interpreter, and what doctors can and can't ask for. We'll go to the next slide. And then for women who do have children, there are a lot of concerns about whether they should keep their children enrolled in programs, because most kids in immigrant families in the US are US citizens, about 95%. They're often eligible for all the programs that a low-income child would be eligible for. And so parents feel like they need to take their kids off programs to protect their family. And in general, that is not needed. There's some really cool new tech tool if you're in California for learning more about this I wanted to share. And let's keep going here. There's a misconception that women can be deported for accessing health care, and that is not the case. Under public charge grounds in particular, it's incredibly, incredibly rare that someone would be deported on that basis. The only thing that could cause a deportation is potentially if someone misrepresents their immigration status, their history in the US, then sometimes that can be a misrepresentation or fraud ground that could add to the government's case against a woman. But generally, under public charge grounds, a woman would not be deported for accessing health care. There is a proposal that has not even moved forward yet to change this, to make it a little bit easier to deport people on public charge grounds. It would still be rare, but the rules may change, and we may need you to take really strong and loud action against this if it goes forward. So stay in touch. And then you may have also heard about the Presidential Healthcare Proclamation. What's really important about this is to know that this is not about making sure immigrants have access to healthcare. It's basically a policy that eliminates or makes it hard for about 2/3 of immigrants to actually enter the US because they would not have access to health care under the proposal. This is also blocked by a court for the time being, but it could go forward. And it basically requires immigrants to enroll or pre-enroll or have money available to enroll in a number of healthcare plans, most of which do not provide access to comprehensive coverage. And the ACA, Marketplace Plans and Subsidies, are not one of the options. So you could enroll in that, which is allowed under law for lawful permanent residents, and it wouldn't help you. So we know it's a sham. I just wanted to show you a little evidence, unfortunately, that not just the public charge rumors, but also other anti-immigrant policies are unfortunately hurting immigrants' access to healthcare and other programs. The Urban Institute does this incredible study, and it showed that at about 14% of adults in immigrant families were chilled from doing normal things like accessing healthcare, and even more, 20% of low-income adults in immigrant families were chilled. And then on the next slide, the Kaiser Family Foundation surveyed health centers and did some interviews and other things, and it showed that almost half of health centers reported that many or some patients were declining to enroll in Medicaid. And it also showed declines among children in immigrant families. Really, really sad to see these trends reverse. You know, we were on a high with more and more people gaining healthcare access every year under the ACA, and Trump came in, and for immigrants, it just It just fell off. So a few final talking points to get you guys psyched to stay active and keep fighting the good fight here. The attacks I talked about today aren't really about immigration. They're a lot like what we heard about a minute ago. They're about race, they're about class, they're about saying to people, if you're not white, if you're not wealthy, you're not welcome here in America. And we're gonna keep fighting together. Some of you joined us and submitted more than 260,000 comments, a record for DHS, against the public charge rule. And we may need to do that again if there's a deportation companion public charge rule. And we would not have been able to get as far as we have in blocking the rule in court without all those comments. And unfortunately, the policies themselves here aren't even that important. It's the combination of all the negative talk and the policies that create this chilling effect. And a really important thing that we need your help with is making sure immigrant families, and particularly women, who make a lot of the healthcare decisions, know the facts so that they make informed choices and they're empowered to make the right choices for their families. We've got a couple key messages for families right now. Do not panic, educate and empower yourself, and mobilize. And last, I wanted to just go through a few take action steps. There are 2 bills in Congress that would block DHS from using federal funds to implement the public charge rule. HR 3222 by Representative Chu and others in the House, and S2482 by Senator Hirono. These are 2 women senators and congresswomen who care about women's access to health care and reproductive rights, and we want to support their efforts. Next, we've got a comment period open. You can take a minute to use our comment template to submit a comment to block the Department of State from continuing with its terrible public charge policies. We've got a Know Your Rights page that includes a lot of the information I mentioned earlier on this, and we have a toolkit for state and local advocacy. And last, you can sign up for our email alerts to find out about ways to take action going forward. With that, I'm going to pass the torch back.
Great. So next up is Jacqueline, and I'm going to share slides in a moment.
Thank you. Are you sharing your screen or am I sharing mine? Oh, there we go. Great, thank you. And thank you, Sylvia, for the nice introduction. I think something to start off and frame our conversation, I really appreciate the way Sylvia talked about white supremacy and how that's showing up in the many different ways in which people are trying to control women's bodies. So to start off, I usually always read this quote, and many of us are very familiar with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, but there's another immigration law that was passed just 7 years before that. It was the Page Act of 1875. And basically what this law did was it prohibited the entry of women specifically from Asia from entering the US. And it was based on a lot of false stereotypes about Asian women engaging in prostitution. And, the stereotype that we were very sexually promiscuous and that we would spoil, a lot of the values of the US once we immigrated here. And what it was really trying to do, though, was to separate families from being together and to control the reproduction of women and the reproduction of Asian families in the United States specifically. So this is a questionnaire that the Page Act required for people who were entering into the US, specifically for Asian women. And it says, have you ever entered into a contract or agreement with any persons or persons whomsoever for a term of service within the United States for lewd and immoral purposes? Do you wish of your own free and voluntary will to go to the United States? Do you go to the United States for the purposes of prostitution? Are you married or single? What are you going to the United States for? What is to be your occupation there? Have you lived in a house of prostitution in Hong Kong, Macau, or China? Have you engaged in prostitution in either of the above places? Are you a virtuous woman? Do you intend to live a virtuous life in the United States? Do you know that you are at liberty now to go to the United States or remain in your own country, and that you cannot be forced to go away from your home? So you can see a lot of the really harmful stereotypes about Asian women in this statement, and how much it was aimed at just keeping Asian women apart from many of their partners and their husbands who had already immigrated to the US and were working in the railroads and in other factories on the West Coast. And so I bring this up because I think it's about bodily autonomy, and it's also about the right to start our families in the ways that we want and where we want. And that bodily autonomy extends just beyond what we're able to do with our bodies. It's about our movement in the world, and being with our families of our choice. So just to give you a little background about why NAPAWF focuses on immigration very heavily, and specifically the intersection of immigration and abortion. 2/3 of APIs in the United States are foreign born. So we're not born in the US, and many of them are naturalized citizens. 92%, myself included, are either immigrants or children of immigrants. So you see 9 out of 10 APIs in the US who are potentially affected by many of the immigration policies that happen in the US or that are being enacted by the Trump administration. There's a rapidly increasing rate of migration among Pacific Islanders. There's one of the fastest growing immigrant communities in the US. And API people come to the US through various pathways. The most common one is family-based visas and receiving sponsorships from family members who are already in the US. Many of them here are on worker visas or are dependents of spouses who are on worker visas. A very high number of API immigrants are refugees and asylees. And actually, some of the highest numbers of refugees and asylees come from Asian countries. So that includes Bhutan and Burma, Pakistan, Nepal. And API undocumented individuals are also the fastest growing API immigrant population. So actually 1 out of every 7 undocumented immigrant is API. So how does that, what does that look like, when we have a fast growing immigrant population in the US, and, how does xenophobia really show up in abortion bans? So a very common abortion ban that we've seen in many states are sex selective abortion bans. And basically what they do is they prohibit or they criminalize providers for providing abortions to people who they suspect may be seeking an abortion due to the sex of the fetus. And basically what this does, or it's based off of very false assumptions and stereotypes about API immigrant women. And, many people will take statistics about women in India and China and say that, these people kill girl babies, and these immigrants are bringing those cultural practices into the US, which is not true, but it is what many state representatives and aunties have used to try and justify these types of bans. So these are actual statements that state legislators have said when trying to pass bills like this. So an Arizona state senator said that we know that female infanticide is pervasive in some areas like China and India. We know that people from those countries and those cultures are moving and immigrating in some reasonable numbers to the United States into Arizona. So you sense a lot of fear and xenophobia in this statement, and the idea that we want to prevent these types of people, if we can't prevent these types of people from coming to the US, we want to prevent them from importing what they believe are things that are happening in those countries. Similarly, in South Dakota, a state representative said, "Let me tell you, our population in South Dakota is a lot more diverse than it ever was. There are cultures that look at sex selection abortion as culturally okay, and I think that's a good thing that we invite them to come. But I think it's also important that we send a message that this is a state that values life, regardless of its sex. So same thing here, you see a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment in here in this statement, but you also see this kind of cloaked statement of, oh, we really value the lives of girl babies and of women, which we know is completely false because these are the same people who will also who fail to do anything to protect women from sexual harassment in the workplace, who aren't doing anything about maternal mortality, etc. So these are the states that have, oh, I actually don't know if this has been updated since I may have taken an outdated image, but regardless, this is from Guttmacher Institute. They have an updated site, updated page on their website with the states that have passed sex-selective abortion bans. So since I last used this slide, Kentucky and Missouri have also passed sex-selective abortion bans. So those are the new ones on the list. The one in Missouri was passed along with a number of other abortion bans, and those bans were blocked, but the reason bans, so the sex-selective and race-selective abortion bans were kept in place. So those remain in effect in Missouri. You'll also note that something I'll bring up later is that these states, many of these states have a very low population of API people, but a very fast growing rate. So many of these states, like South Dakota and Arizona, as as we saw in those quotes, are starting to see a lot more API immigrants coming to those states. And because of those increasing numbers, there's fear and xenophobia that takes over along with this anti-abortion sentiment that compounds together to create these sex-selective abortion bans that really are to serve a larger goal of chipping away at abortion rights broadly, but are using API women and immigrant women and throwing them under the bus on the way there. So just, we've talked about how racist and xenophobic these bans are. It opens the door for racial profiling of API women. So if you can imagine being an immigrant woman and you're at a hospital or you're at a abortion clinic and you're seeking an abortion and the doctor refuses to give you an abortion solely based off of, the suspicion that you may be getting an abortion based on the sex of the fetus. So if you ask what the sex of the fetus is and it's a female, then a doctor could technically deny you an abortion because they are afraid of being criminalized due to a sex-selective abortion ban. So it's also a civil rights issue, and this discrimination that could happen in clinics. And just because, the doctors are trying to do their jobs, but these bans are really getting in the way of really serving API women and giving them the healthcare they need. It has no factual basis, so there's actually no evidence of sex selection in the US among API women at all. This is something that has never been proven by the proponents of this bill. And actually there was a study done a few years ago that showed that API women actually have more girl babies than white women by a very small percentage. So, it's completely false. And again, it's really just based off of this anti-immigrant sentiment about what people think is happening in other countries. The bill has mostly been moving in the States, so it was very popular a few years ago, and it was introduced in several states last year. It's nowadays it's usually combined with race-selective abortion bans and Down syndrome bans. So these are broadly known as reason bans. And so any abortion ban in which somebody is stopped from getting an abortion based on the reason for which they are seeking an abortion. And it currently exists at the federal level, but there's no movement on it, and we like it that way. So we're not making any noise about it. So if it does come up, though, we are really ready to combat these bans with, and really highlighting the fact that they are very racist and based on false stereotypes and actually harm API women. So API women have also been criminalized before for their pregnancy outcomes, regardless of whether or not they were seeking an abortion or, trying to self-manage their abortions. I think many of these cases showed that a lot of authorities and police and providers don't trust API women to make decisions about their own bodies. So on the left side, we have Purvi Patel. Purvi Patel was living in Indiana, and she gave birth to a stillborn in her home in southern Indiana. And it was found in her text messages that she was texting a friend about ordering mifepristone, but we don't know if she actually took those pills. And regardless, that it shouldn't matter. But because Purvi was, she went to the hospital. She was hemorrhaging and had excessive bleeding, and she was seeking healthcare at the hospital. The people there called the police on her, and later she was charged with feticide. And the assumption was that she killed her fetus, and that she couldn't be trusted with how she managed her birth and the circumstances of her pregnancy. So she was sentenced to 20 years in prison, and was released after 2. On the right side, there's Bebe Shuai, also in Indiana. So these happened within a couple of years of each other under Mike Pence's Indiana. Bebe Shuai attempted suicide, and she survived, but her fetus at 33 weeks did not. And when Bebe survived, she really wanted her fetus to survive as well. And they tried to save the fetus through an emergency C-section and didn't make it. Bebe was also charged with feticide and attempted murder, despite her wishes of wanting her child to survive if she did too. And I think in both of these, so it's worth noting that the only 2 women that have been charged with feticide in Indiana are API women. And a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment happened around these instances. When Purvi was in the hospital, she was just seeking care for a hemorrhage, and people were asking her, oh, do your parents know are your parents Indian? Do your parents know who the father is? What's the race of the father of this child? Really inappropriate questions that really would not have been asked of a white woman if she had been sent to the hospital and hemorrhaging. So a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment against Purvi and her family. Her family was a working class family who had a restaurant, and there were many attacks against her family. Similarly with Bebe, there was just a lot of mistrust around, her being an immigrant working woman. And, I think all we need to say is that these were the only 2 women who have been charged with feticide, and they're both API women. I think if you go to the next slide. Yes, and the other thing that's worth noting is that at around the same time that Bebe and Purvi's cases were coming through, that's when Indiana's sex-selective abortion ban was being passed. So even if these cases weren't specifically about abortion, they were about API women's and immigrant women's decisions about their bodies and what they were able to do about their pregnancies. And I think it just shows a general mistrust about API and immigrant women around their own pregnancies. Lastly, and Sivia touched on this, was 2 years ago, an unaccompanied minor who was known anonymously as Jane Doe sought an abortion while she was in detention in a facility in Texas. And at the time, she was not yet quite near the 20-week mark, which in Texas, there's a 20-week ban on obtaining an abortion. She was brought to a fake clinic. So the Office of Refugee Resettlement, who oversees unaccompanied minors and that was led by Scott Lloyd, are required to basically be the overseers and determine whether or not somebody is allowed to get an abortion, and or needed the approval of Scott Lloyd before an unaccompanied minor would be able to have an abortion. So they brought her to a crisis pregnancy center. That's where they all get their quote counseling. And Jane Doe was blocked from getting an abortion. There is a whole legal battle that ensued after that. I don't remember all of the details. I think ACLU definitely has all of that information because they represented Jane Doe in that case. But basically, she was able to receive a judicial bypass. Then that was blocked, and then that was appealed, and then it went to the DC Circuit. And all of this time, throughout this entire time, we're getting closer and closer to the 20-week mark. Eventually, Jane was able to get her abortion. But later on, we saw many cases with other Janes, so Jane Moe, Rowan Poe, and other accompanied minors in very similar situations who were also denied their abortions. And we also know that a couple of these became pregnant as a result of sexual violence. And we know, we talked a little bit about Scott Lloyd, but, this is a man a very privileged white man, very conservative, incredibly Catholic, and had no experience working with refugee populations and no experience working with women. And he was the one who was in charge of deciding whether or not these young women were able to get an abortion. And he was tracking their menstrual periods, which is still a thing that's happening now. There were rumors that he had actually flown down to meet with an accompanied minor to talk her out of getting an abortion. And you don't see this happening in many other places. It really is, it really was an attempt to prevent immigrant women and young immigrant women from being able to decide, when they could have children, where they could have children, and how and under what circumstances. And, just control over their entire bodies beyond just because of the fact that they were women, but because they're immigrants as well. So I want to give a nod to National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health and Justice for Jane and the National Network for Abortion Funds. These were all organizations, and the ACLU, of course, who were very heavily involved in this case. And I recommend looking up information from those organizations if you want to learn more about Jane Doe. But it would definitely be very remiss not to talk about Jane Doe in a conversation about abortion and immigration. And, it's very likely that this is something that things like this are continuing to happen under the Trump administration and in detention facilities under the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And so, even though the Jane Doe case has got much attention, I think it's important that we stay vigilant about what is happening in our detention facilities.
Great. Thank you so much, Jacqueline and Sonia, for those really, really informative and powerful presentations. We have a couple of minutes for questions, but first I wanted to talk about this bill that we have all been working on, the National Immigration Law Center and NAPOF as well, and it's called the Heal for Immigrant Women and Families Act. So this would remove these really discriminatory legal barriers that keep immigrants from accessing publicly funded healthcare programs that they pay into. So Jacqueline, I don't know if you wanted to say just a little bit more about that before we start answering some questions that came in through the registration.
Sure, I can definitely talk about the HEAL Act. So like Shannon mentioned, all of the organizations represented here and several others are working on this bill. It was reintroduced in the House side by Representatives Pramila Jayapal and Deb Haaland just a couple of months ago. And like Shannon mentioned, it removes the 5-year bar that immigrants have to wait before they're eligible for Medicaid and CHIP. So right now, even after you receive your green card or LPR status, you have to wait another 5 years before you're even eligible for those programs. So this is specifically impacting low-income immigrant people. And we know from Guttmacher that 48% of low-income immigrant women are uninsured. That's nearly half. and that cuts them off from many crucial services such as family planning and contraception and maternal care. It also enables DACA recipients to enroll in Medicaid and to be able to purchase plans from the ACA, which we know was originally excluded from when the ACA was originally passed. And it restores Medicaid eligibility for COFA migrants, which are migrants from Palau, Marshall Islands, and Micronesia. Since 1996, they have not been eligible for Medicaid. And lastly, something that's new in this version of the bill is that it enables undocumented folks to purchase plans from the ACA with tax credits and subsidies. And this was a really important addition because this enables them to access the healthcare that everybody else is able to access, and to be able to use their money and receive subsidies for really critical healthcare, despite their status. So, like I said, this bill was introduced in the House 2 months ago. I highly encourage everyone to see if your representatives are on the bill. I know Shannon is leading that effort for NCJW. And, it's in light of everything that Sonia had talked about in public charge and all of these attacks on immigrants and healthcare, it's so important that we make a very unified effort to remove the 5-year bar and remove so many of the barriers that are already in place in preventing immigrants from receiving the health care that they need and preventing immigrant women from receiving a lot of the reproductive health care that's included in our federal programs.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline, for saying more about that. And we really, really appreciate your leadership and NAPAWF's leadership on this bill. It's so, so important. So thank you so much. So if you have any questions, you can drop them in the chat box. We're going to first look at this question really quickly that came in via the registration, and I think it's really important to answer. So, what can abortion and women's health service providers do to help create safe spaces for immigrants seeking reproductive health care services?
Sorry, I was just unmuting myself. Are you guys hearing an echo? I'm so sorry. I'm wondering if others can mute themselves and if that would help. Okay, well, I'll just try my best here. So there's actually a ton that healthcare providers can do to make sure their parents know their legal rights and to protect them when they're accessing services. There's just some general things you all should know, which is that under federal guidance, both ICE, which is the agency that conducts immigration enforcement, and Customs and Border Patrol, which secures the borders, they consider hospitals and healthcare facilities to be sensitive locations. And there's a memo that says that enforcement actions should not be conducted in those places. There's also privacy protections in federal programs. There are limitations on immigration officers' ability to enter places without a warrant or consent. People have the right to remain silent. And there are also some problems, like the fact that officers can look at things that are in plain view. So for example, if a clinic has not secured an area as private, an officer enters, there's a list of names there, and it's in plain view, then that's not really a good practice. It's not safe. So we at the National Immigration Law Center have a healthcare toolkit that providers can access. On our website, we also have a Know Your Rights guide. It's called Healthcare Providers and Immigration Enforcement. There's a lot of education about what rights are for individuals and for health centers or health clinics. And then there's also a set of policies that we suggest health centers and clinics and providers adopt. And I'll just give you a few. You want to have a written policy about private areas. You want to be careful of what's in public view. You want to avoid collecting immigration status information and holding that. You want to provide educational materials to women. You want to be ready to access a lawyer if an issue arises where an agent comes. You want to have a staffer authorized to be trained to kind of handle it and hold them off. And there are other things you can do as well, but those are just some of the top ones. Thanks.
If I can add, Shannon, I just would like to note that despite what Sonia said, and despite the laws that prohibit ICE and law enforcement from being in these areas within clinics, within hospitals, the fact is they do use them to target patients. And the result that we're all seeing is that women, particularly DACA, women are afraid to go planning, and in the case of terminations, because of their fear, they're waiting much longer, which then makes the procedure either more costly or in some cases inaccessible.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sylvia. And that's why Sonia's resources that she mentioned about knowing your rights and about providers knowing their rights and the best practices are so important. Yeah, so I think that's all of the time that we have for questions, actually. So I'm going to turn it back over to Sylvia to quickly wrap us up. If you do have any more questions, you can feel free to send them to me, and I can either answer them or I will relay them to the right people, and I will get you a response, because these are really important questions and really important topics. So Sylvia, if you can quickly wrap us up, that would be great.
Thank you. Thank you to everybody for joining us today on the webinar and for your questions. Even though we didn't get to them, they will be answered in time, I'm confident. And I want to express our gratitude to Jacqueline and Sonia for their help in planning and making this webinar happen. We truly value the partnership and are proud to work alongside you to lift up the intersection of abortion and immigrant issues. After having learned so much from today's experts, I urge everyone to get involved, to use this information in your advocacy work. Keep an eye out for an email from NCJW containing all the resources that Sonia and Jacqueline referenced during the webinar. And you can also check out NCJW's website to find information about the HEAL Act that was just discussed, the talking points, and an action alert encouraging your representatives to co-sponsor this critical bill. Additionally, the follow-up email will include a recording of this webinar and a short evaluation. So your feedback informs future programming. Please take a moment to fill it out. And on that note, please save the date for the next LEAD webinar, January 15th at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. We will be commemorating the 47th anniversary of Roe v. Wade, at a very auspicious time, I might note, with a panel of experts discussing reproductive health, rights, and justice in the various states, courts, and on the federal level. Please let us know if you can assist, if you need any assistance in your reproductive health rights and justice or immigrant work. And if you have any questions or concerns, please contact Ari Solomon at asolomon@ncjw.org or Shannon Russell, srussell@ncjw.org. Thanks again for joining us, and another huge thanks to Jacqueline and Sonia. We wish you all a wonderful holiday season and a very happy new year.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, everyone.